In the small, picture-perfect community of Willow Creek, every house looked as if it had been plucked from a real estate magazine cover. Pristine lawns, identical mailboxes, and driveways that gleamed under the morning sun. It was the kind of neighborhood that advertised peace and order on the surface. But beneath that neat exterior, the place was a pressure cooker of control, gossip, and obsession with rules. The Homeowners Association, known simply as the HOA, was the silent dictator of this little world. Their word was law, their fines unavoidable, and their reach total. For years the residents tolerated them, paying their dues and fixing every little violation that came their way. But that all changed when they turned their sights on one man, Daniel Harker. Daniel wasn't the kind of person who sought trouble. A quiet, hard-working engineer, he had bought his modest corner house 3 years earlier. It wasn't the biggest or the fanciest property in Willow Creek, but it was his pride, a symbol of years of saving, long work nights, and sacrifice. He loved his home, especially the wide lawn that wrapped around it like a green carpet. That lawn, however, would become his undoing. It began with a simple letter, a courtesy notice, as the HOA called it. According to them, Daniel's grass exceeded the community's approved height by 2 inches. It seemed trivial, even laughable, but the letter was written in cold, official tones, warning that failure to correct the violation could result in fines and further action. Daniel mowed the lawn that evening, dismissing it as a minor inconvenience. He didn't know that the notice was just the beginning. A week later, another letter arrived, this one less polite. The HOA claimed he had failed to maintain uniform standards and issued a fine of $150. Daniel, confused, sent them a photo of his neatly trimmed yard. The response came swiftly. Another fine, this time for improper edging and visible brown patches. It didn't matter that the grass was healthy or that the weather had been unusually hot. The HOA had decided he was in violation, and that was that. Soon, the fines piled up. $150 became $300, then $500, then over $1,000. Every letter grew more aggressive, citing bylaws and community expectations. The language suggested defiance, non-compliance, even disrespect for the neighborhood's integrity. Neighbors began to whisper. Some avoided eye contact. Others muttered that Daniel was bringing down property values. The HOA's president, a sharp-tongued woman named Marjorie Keene, seemed almost proud of her crusade. Under her leadership, the board had fined half the neighborhood for minor infractions. But Daniel became their prime example, the scapegoat, the warning to others. When Daniel refused to pay the growing mountain of fines, the HOA took the next step. They placed a lien on his property. The notice arrived on a cold morning in March, stamped with official language and threats of foreclosure if the debt remained unpaid. Daniel was stunned. He had no idea they could even do that. But under the HOA's bylaws, hidden deep in the paperwork every homeowner had signed without reading, the board had the power to seize property for unpaid fines. He sought legal help, but every attorney he spoke to said the same thing. You signed the agreement when you bought the house. The HOA's within their rights. Desperate, Daniel appealed to the board directly. They held a hearing, a mockery of fairness where Marjorie and her allies smirked behind a long wooden table while Daniel tried to reason with them. They rejected his appeal in under 10 minutes. 3 months later, foreclosure proceedings began. Daniel watched helplessly as his mailbox filled with legal notices. His savings evaporated in legal fees and penalty charges. His credit plummeted. The home he had built with so much pride was slipping away, because of grass. By summer, the HOA succeeded. Daniel lost his house. It was auctioned to a new buyer for a fraction of its value. The HOA congratulated themselves on preserving the community's standards. Neighbors watched as Daniel packed his belongings into a rented van and drove away, their curiosity tinged with unease. But what they didn't know was that Daniel wasn't gone. He was watching, waiting, because while the HOA had taken his house, Daniel had discovered something they hadn't expected, a loophole. It started with a single document, a filing error in the county registrar's office that changed everything. Buried in the paperwork was an outdated clause regarding property transfers and nonprofit ownership. The HOA, in their arrogance, had never corrected it. That small mistake gave Daniel an idea, a dangerous, brilliant, and legally sound idea. They had taken his home through the law. Now he would use the law to take theirs. The seed of revenge had been planted. And in Willow Creek, where every blade of grass was measured, something far more explosive was about to grow. After losing his house, Daniel Harker disappeared from Willow Creek, or at least that's what everyone thought. The truth was that he had moved just 5 miles away, into a modest apartment overlooking the same hills that framed his old neighborhood. From there he began to study. At first it was out of bitterness. Nights were long, and sleep never came easily. The humiliation of losing everything over something as ridiculous as grass height burned in his mind like a slow fire. But that bitterness soon transformed into obsession. Daniel started to learn everything he could about the inner workings of homeowners associations, their bylaws, their financial structures, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. What he found shocked him. The HOA wasn't some government agency or special authority. It was a nonprofit corporation, run by volunteers, subject to state laws, and open to the same liabilities as any small business. They had power only because the residents allowed it. And buried in their own charter was a clause that made them extremely vulnerable. The discovery came late one night, while Daniel was combing through the county's public land records online. Every HOA had to register with the state to operate legally. Their charter, financial disclosures, and board member filings were all public information. And there, on page 67 of an old digital file, Daniel found it. A small but crucial mistake. The Willow Creek Homeowners Association had been established 21 years earlier. Its incorporation status was tied to a community trust that technically owned the HOA's assets, including the clubhouse, park areas, and even the board's main office building. But 5 years ago, during a routine renewal, the board had filed their paperwork incorrectly. The trust had been dissolved, leaving a gap in the chain of ownership. Legally speaking, the HOA no longer had a rightful claim to the very assets it controlled. It was a clerical error, one no one noticed because the board's paperwork had continued under the same name. But without that trust in place, they had no legal ownership over the HOA's property. And that's when Daniel realized it. The loophole. If he filed as a new entity under the same lapsed trust name, he could technically become the new owner of all HOA assets previously under that trust, because it had never been reactivated. It was the kind of mistake that only a bureaucratic monster like the HOA could make. Daniel tested his theory by consulting an attorney under an alias. The lawyer confirmed what Daniel suspected. The lapse meant the old trust had been legally abandoned. Anyone could re-establish it by paying the reinstatement fee and filing the correct documents. For just $312, Daniel could take control of the very foundation that the HOA operated under. He didn't hesitate. The process took weeks. He created a shell company, filed the necessary forms, and registered the new entity, the Willow Creek Community Trust, LLC. The name was identical to the old one, minus a single comma. To the county system, it appeared as a corrected version of the same entity. Within a month, it was official. The trust was his. Daniel sat back in his chair and stared at the confirmation email. It was surreal. The HOA had taken his house, but he had taken their foundation. On paper, he now owned every parcel, building, and communal property under the trust's jurisdiction. He didn't move right away. Patience was key. If he revealed himself too soon, the board might contest it, or worse, fix the mistake. So he waited, watching the HOA's meetings through public live streams and reading their monthly newsletters. The same smug faces filled the boardroom. Marjorie Keene still sat at the head of the table barking orders about lawn inspections and paint color violations. Her voice carried the same authority that had once stripped Daniel of everything. But now, he knew something she didn't. Her kingdom was built on paper walls. Slowly, Daniel began preparing his next move. He started by acquiring small stakes in nearby properties, empty lots adjacent to the HOA's communal land. Using his new trust, he filed easement claims that overlapped with the HOA's boundaries. No one noticed. He hired an accountant to audit the trust's records, claiming he was doing routine maintenance. The report that came back confirmed his suspicion. The HOA had been using trust-owned funds for personal expenses, which was technically misappropriation. That meant criminal liability for the board if the trust's ownership changed hands, and it already had. The deeper Daniel dug, the uglier the picture became. The HOA had used residents' dues to pay for private events, board dinners, and even landscaping around Marjorie's home. Tens of thousands of dollars had been siphoned into administrative costs. The irony was delicious. By the end of the summer, Daniel's plan was ready. Every document, every deed, every signature was in place. All that was left was to deliver the final blow. He would make his move at the next annual HOA meeting, the one where Marjorie would be proudly announcing new restrictions on lawn, ornamentation, and fence coloration. The perfect audience. In the meantime, he quietly notified the county clerk's office of an ownership update for the HOA's trust-held assets. They processed it without question. After all, everything appeared legitimate. When the board gathered that evening, they had no idea that the building they were sitting in, the one with the Willow Creek HOA logo proudly displayed on the door, no longer legally belonged to them. It now belonged to Daniel, the man they had humiliated, the man they had forced out of his home, the man whose grass had been 2 inches too high, and in less than 24 hours, they were about to find out. The morning of the Willow Creek HOA annual meeting began like any other in the neighborhood, quiet, orderly, and artificial. Lawns had been trimmed to the board-approved height, flags positioned at regulation angles, and driveways swept clean. It was a place obsessed with perfection, where every minor deviation became a moral offense. Marjorie Keene, the long-reigning HOA president, arrived early, her heels clicking confidently across the tiled floor of the community clubhouse. The large room smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh coffee. She took her usual seat at the head of the long oak table, the same table where, a year before, she had signed off on Daniel Harker's foreclosure. Her fellow board members trickled in. Harold, the treasurer who treated late fees like a personal mission. Susan, who ran the landscaping committee with militant precision. And Rick, whose sole purpose seemed to be nodding at everything Marjorie said. They chatted idly about dues, property values, and the wonderful progress their leadership had made. Outside, homeowners gathered with their folding chairs and clipboards, ready for another evening of monotone speeches about community harmony. None of them expected what was about to happen. Daniel had been preparing for this moment for months. He had filed all the right documents, verified the ownership transfers, and ensured the county database reflected his trust as the legal entity controlling the HOA's assets. Everything was legitimate, airtight, and irreversible, at least not without his consent. The only thing missing was the public reveal. As the meeting began, Marjorie launched into her speech about maintaining the integrity of Willow Creek. Her words dripped with self-importance as she spoke of the HOA's accomplishments, new paint color restrictions, increased dues for community beautification, and stricter enforcement policies. The crowd listened, some applauding politely, others trying to stay awake. When she opened the floor to new business, Daniel stood from the back row. He didn't need to say a word. He simply walked to the front of the room, placed a thick folder on the table, and handed a letter to the secretary. The woman frowned, scanning it briefly before passing it to Marjorie. As Marjorie read the letter, her confident expression faltered. Then she read it again. The letter was formal, precise, and devastating. It notified the board that, effective immediately, the Willow Creek Community Trust, the legal owner of all HOA assets, was under new management. The new managing trustee was Daniel Harker. The letter also included county registration numbers stamped and verified. Marjorie's voice cracked as she tried to speak. She stammered something about clerical errors and impossible claims, but Daniel remained silent. The crowd began murmuring, confusion spreading like wildfire through the room. Daniel reached into his folder again and laid out copies of the property filings. Each document bore the same verification seal from the county office. The trust name, the ownership records, the board filings, all pointed to him. The HOA's legal existence had just been stripped away, right in front of everyone. Then came the final page, a notice of termination of access. It revoked the board's authorization to operate under the HOA's name and demanded the immediate surrender of all community property, financial records, and electronic accounts pending audit. Gasps filled the room. The HOA board members froze, their faces pale. Marjorie tried to stand, to retake control of the meeting, but the homeowners had already turned their eyes to Daniel. The man they had once ridiculed now stood as the de facto owner of everything they controlled. The irony was almost poetic. For years, the HOA had bullied homeowners through technicalities, clauses, and bylaws. Now those same rules, twisted and perfected by Daniel, had become their undoing. Marjorie attempted to call security, but the guards stationed outside were contractors hired under the trust's authority. Daniel had already filed an order rescinding their service agreement with the HOA board. The guards simply folded their arms and waited. One by one, the board members began arguing, their voices overlapping in desperation. Harold protested that the documents were forged. Susan accused Daniel of hacking the records. Rick just sat in stunned silence, his mouth slightly open. But Daniel didn't need to argue. The truth was already public. The county's own database reflected the ownership transfer. Anyone with a phone could verify it, and many residents did, pulling up the record and reading it aloud. Marjorie's empire had fallen in less than 5 minutes. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Some homeowners laughed quietly, others shouted questions, and a few demanded refunds for years of excessive dues. The illusion of authority had shattered. The HOA, once a feared institution, now looked like a group of amateurs caught in their own trap. Daniel gathered his papers, calm and deliberate, and left the folder on the table. As he turned to leave, he looked around the room one last time. The people who had once avoided him now stared with awe and disbelief. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply walked out. By the next morning, the news had spread across Willow Creek. Emails flew between residents, social media threads lit up, and the story began to take on a life of its own. Some hailed Daniel as a hero. Others whispered that he was dangerous. But everyone agreed on one thing. The HOA was finished, or so they thought, because for Daniel, simply taking their property wasn't enough. He had won the legal battle, but the war for control was just beginning. Behind the scenes, the remnants of the board scrambled to fight back. They called emergency meetings, reached out to lawyers, and even tried to accuse Daniel of fraud. But their problem was deeper than paperwork. It was money. Without access to the trust, their accounts were frozen. Their insurance policies were invalid. Even their ability to collect dues had been revoked. The entire structure of Willow Creek's authority had collapsed overnight. But power doesn't disappear quietly. Marjorie, furious and humiliated, began plotting her retaliation. And Daniel, now in control of everything she once ruled, had plans of his own. Plans that would change Willow Creek forever. The day after the takeover, Willow Creek woke up to confusion and a strange sense of quiet. For years, the neighborhood had lived under the HOA's unrelenting rule. Daily patrols for violations, warning letters in mailboxes, fines that appeared without reason. But that morning, no one came around with clipboards. No one measured grass. No one scolded a resident for leaving a trash bin out too long. Instead, people stepped onto their driveways in disbelief. Some chatted over fences, cautiously optimistic. Others waited, expecting Marjorie or her board to show up at any moment and restore order. But the hours passed, and the silence held. Inside her home, Marjorie Keene sat at her dining table, surrounded by paperwork and half-empty coffee mugs. The HOA office had been locked overnight, Daniel's doing, and their files, computers, and bank access were gone. Even the email servers had been transferred under his newly acquired trust domain. The realization stung like a slap. The kingdom she'd built over 2 decades was gone. Her phone rang non-stop, board members panicking, homeowners demanding answers, the HOA's lawyer trying to explain that technically, Daniel was now in charge. The board's charter had been invalidated the moment the trust switched ownership. They could file a lawsuit, yes, but that would take months, maybe years, and they didn't have the funds to even begin. By noon, Marjorie issued a desperate statement on the community's social media page. She claimed Daniel's move was fraudulent, unethical, and dangerous. She urged residents not to cooperate with him and to stand united against this unlawful takeover. But the residents didn't rally behind her. They remembered every fine, every condescending letter, every time she humiliated a neighbor over a technicality. For years, she'd ruled them with fear, and now that fear was gone. Comments flooded beneath her post, not with support, but with relief. People cheered Daniel's name. Some called him a legend, others a genius. Photos from the meeting circulated online. Marjorie's pale face frozen in shock, Daniel calmly holding his folder. Within hours, the story went viral beyond the neighborhood. Even local news outlets began calling it the HOA reversal. But Daniel stayed silent. He didn't speak to reporters, didn't post online. He worked quietly, methodically, the same way he always had. His first move as the new trustee was symbolic. The next morning, the HOA office door bore a new sign, the Willow Creek Community Trust, under new management. Underneath, a single line read, serving homeowners, not controlling them. Residents gathered outside the office, hesitant but curious. Daniel had reopened the doors, not to fine anyone, but to listen. He invited homeowners to share their complaints, their frustrations, and their stories. For the first time, people felt heard. Daniel discovered how deep the resentment ran. Families had paid thousands in unjust fines. Elderly residents had been bullied into repainting homes at their own expense. Single parents had been threatened with liens over minor landscaping infractions. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was exploitation. And now that power was gone, Daniel began refunding residents where he could, starting with those hit hardest. He used the HOA's own misappropriated funds, the money Marjorie and her board had siphoned into administrative fees. Every transaction was legal, backed by the trust's new authority. The mood in Willow Creek began to shift. The same neighbors who once lived in fear of inspection now planted flowers, built garden beds, painted shutters, bright colors, things the old HOA would have banned. The neighborhood started to look alive again. But peace, as Daniel knew too well, never lasted long. Behind the scenes, Marjorie wasn't done. She had contacted the HOA's former attorney, a man named David Larkin, known for his ruthless efficiency. Together, they began crafting a counterattack. Their argument was simple. Daniel's acquisition of the trust might have been legal, but his intent was malicious. They planned to accuse him of fraudulent conversion and misrepresentation of ownership, hoping to bury him in lawsuits. They also filed for reinstatement of the HOA's original charter, claiming the dissolution had been an administrative mistake. If approved, they could technically reform the HOA under a new name and reclaim power. Daniel saw it coming. He had anticipated their every move. He'd already secured legal protections for the trust, transferring key assets into holding agreements that required unanimous homeowner approval to change. Even if the old board reformed, they would have no authority over those assets without the residents' consent. Still, Daniel knew that Marjorie's influence ran deep. She wasn't just a bureaucrat, she was a manipulator. Soon, whispers began circulating. Anonymous flyers appeared in mailboxes, accusing Daniel of being a criminal and squatter. Fake social media pages spread rumors that he planned to sell the community land for profit. Fear began to creep back in. Marjorie's campaign worked better than he expected. Some residents started to doubt Daniel's motives. Others began to panic, worried that the neighborhood's property values would collapse without an HOA. For Daniel, it was a familiar feeling, being isolated, mistrusted and blamed, but this time he wasn't alone. A group of homeowners, fed up with Marjorie's lies, stepped forward to support him. They formed a new advisory committee under the trust, residents who wanted transparency, not control. Daniel made sure everything they did was public, meetings recorded, budgets open, decisions voted on. It was everything the old HOA never was. Still, the legal storm gathered on the horizon. Marjorie had resources and connections, and she was determined to claw her way back to power. Daniel prepared for the inevitable. He began compiling evidence: financial records, audit trails, emails showing misuse of HOA funds, and minutes from board meetings that exposed corruption. He knew that when Marjorie struck, he'd be ready to strike back harder. But even as he worked, he couldn't shake a strange thought. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It had started that way, yes, but now it was something larger. A chance to rebuild what the HOA had destroyed. A chance to prove that order didn't have to come from fear. The community had started to heal, but the war for its soul was far from over, and as the next board election approached, an election Marjorie secretly planned to hijack, Daniel realized that taking their property was only the beginning. To truly win, he'd have to take back their power. Autumn arrived in Willow Creek with crisp mornings and the slow rustle of dying leaves. The lawns, once meticulously trimmed to HOA standards, now varied in height and color, a patchwork of individuality that made the old board seethe from afar. For months, Daniel's version of the neighborhood had flourished. People smiled more. Children played on sidewalks without fear of being scolded for noise. The tension that once strangled the community had loosened its grip. But beneath the calm surface, something was stirring. Marjorie Keene had been quiet too long. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. She had spent weeks meeting with lawyers, digging through archives and contacting old allies. Her humiliation during the annual meeting had spread online like wildfire, and she loathed every second of it. Videos of her frozen expression circulated with mocking captions. The internet called her Queen of the Lawns, a nickname that clung like poison. But humiliation has a way of breeding obsession. If Daniel had used the law to take her power, then she would use the law to destroy him. Her attorney, David Larkin, crafted a brutal plan. They filed a lawsuit accusing Daniel of fraudulent acquisition of assets, misuse of trust authority, and intentional infliction of financial harm. The goal wasn't necessarily to win, it was to drain Daniel, to bury him in paperwork, hearings, and fees until he couldn't fight anymore. When Daniel received the thick envelope stamped with the county court seal, he wasn't surprised. He had been expecting it. Still, the sight of his name on the legal complaint brought back a familiar chill. It reminded him of the first letter he ever received from the HOA, the one that started this all. But this time, he wasn't powerless. He spent long nights preparing his defense, combing through every document and audit he'd collected. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every homeowner who'd ever been bullied by that board. The court filings grew uglier by the week. Marjorie's team accused Daniel of falsifying trust documents, manipulating county clerks, and even embezzling funds. Each accusation was more desperate than the last, but together they painted a portrait of chaos that frightened some residents. Rumors began to swirl again. Some neighbors questioned whether Daniel's takeover had really been legal. Others wondered if the community would collapse under mounting legal pressure. The uncertainty spread like mold, quietly, invisibly, until everyone could feel it. Marjorie seized that doubt and turned it into a weapon. She began holding secret meetings with residents, small groups, always framed as concerned citizens. She promised them stability, professionalism, and the return of order. She spoke in soothing tones, pretending to be the voice of reason, and people listened. Her campaign grew quietly, fueled by fear and nostalgia. Flyers reappeared on doors, slickly printed, this time with phrases like, "Restore Willow Creek's pride," and bring back accountability. Daniel watched from a distance, recognizing her strategy for what it was: manipulation disguised as leadership. He knew she'd try to stage a coup, a fake election designed to re-establish her control. What he didn't expect was how quickly the tide began to turn. The lawsuit wore on. Court dates loomed. Legal fees climbed. Every night Daniel worked late in his small office, surrounded by stacks of documents and notes. The residents who supported him grew restless. Some asked why he didn't just make peace with Marjorie. Others accused him of dragging the neighborhood into chaos. He could feel it, the same isolation he'd felt before, when the HOA turned the community against him. But now the stakes were higher. Then one morning, everything changed. A courier arrived at Daniel's door carrying an official letter from the county property office. Inside was a copy of a new filing, the Willow Creek Preservation Association, Inc. The name was different, but the purpose was clear. It was Marjorie's new HOA. She had done it again. By exploiting a loophole in state law, she had formed a new organization to replace the dissolved HOA, claiming to represent the will of the homeowners. The timing was no coincidence. The new entity's formation aligned perfectly with her court filings. If she won her lawsuit, she could claim that the trust's assets were unlawfully taken and therefore belonged under her new HOA's management. In essence, she was trying to rebuild her empire, brick by legal brick. Daniel's first reaction was frustration. His second was determination. He refused to be bullied by the same tactics that had ruined his life once before. He called an emergency meeting under the trust, inviting every resident in the community. Flyers went up, emails were sent, and word spread quickly. That night, more people attended than ever before, some loyal to Daniel, others curious, and a few whispering in support of Marjorie. The community center buzzed with tension. Daniel stood before them, not as a ruler, but as one of them. He explained the truth calmly and clearly. The trust's takeover had been legal, transparent, and filed under state authority. Every dime recovered had gone back into community repairs, refunds, and beautification projects. He showed records, receipts, and before and after images of homes that had been restored, not fined. Then, he showed the residents something else: evidence from the HOA's old financial records, transactions that linked Marjorie and her board to thousands in personal spending, luxury dinners, vacations labeled as board retreats, and landscaping invoices for their private properties. Gasps rippled through the room. Daniel didn't need to raise his voice. He simply told them that the same people who had fined them over grass and paint colors had been stealing from them all along. The meeting ended with applause, but Daniel knew it wasn't victory yet. Marjorie still had her lawsuit, and her influence ran deeper than most realized. 2 days later, court proceedings began. The old board members sat together like vultures in tailored suits, glaring at Daniel as if he were an intruder in their kingdom. But Daniel had come prepared. His attorney presented ironclad documentation proving the trust's abandonment and lawful reinstatement. The judge listened patiently, expression unreadable. When it was Marjorie's turn, her voice trembled, not with fear but with rage. She called Daniel a manipulator, an opportunist, a disgruntled homeowner seeking revenge. But the evidence betrayed her. Every question her lawyer dodged made her case weaker. Every document Daniel's side presented made his stronger. By the end of the hearing, the tide had turned. The judge announced a postponement for final review, but his tone carried weight. He praised Daniel's meticulous records and reminded Marjorie's team that technical negligence does not excuse loss of control. Outside the courthouse, Daniel could feel the shift. Reporters swarmed, residents whispered, and Marjorie, once the symbol of authority, looked small, cornered, and furious. But Daniel knew better than to celebrate. People like Marjorie didn't go down quietly. When power slips through their fingers, they find new ways to claw it back. And deep down, Daniel sensed that this wasn't the end. The legal war might soon close, but the personal one was far from over, because in Willow Creek, control was an addiction. and Marjorie Keene wasn't ready to let go.